Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is a course that is being offered in a series of 20 lectures, and at the very onset I must say that this is a course that is heavily interdisciplinary in nature, which means that there are multiple ways, more than one ways, to actually look at gender, to actually understand gender and to understand society. And this course, this series of 20 lectures will give you only one way of understanding gender in society, primarily focusing on the sociological ways. So having said that, I want to introduce you to the 20 lectures that we will be covering as part of this course, starting with today's introductory session, where we will talk about very basic conceptual frameworks, concepts of gender, of society, and some of the key characteristic issues and problems that we find in society that we live in with regard to gender. So next class we will talk about biology and gender, particularly talking about relations and differences between the biological condition of the body, what we commonly understand to be the biological sex of the body, and gender. And we will also look at sexuality of a person. We will look at how the idea of biological condition of the body and gender, they appear in society, they are expressed in society, and oftentimes are confused. So we will talk about that conceptual difference in the second lecture. In the third lecture, we will talk about the social constructions of gender, where we will talk primarily about how gender as a category, how gender as a process is socially constructed, and we will talk about how gender roles and relations are formed in society, what we understand by gender socialization, what we understand by gender stereotyping, and how do we find issues of inequality or gender inequality, to be specific, expressed in society. So that is pretty much what we will cover in the third lecture. The fourth lecture will cover the historical and theoretical premises of gender, where we will particularly talk about the socio-historical contexts, the the histories, the previous socio-historical context that has happened to shape gender relations, to shape gender patterns in societies that we live in. So we will talk about colonialism, we will talk about colonial ethnic relations, and we will also talk about gender's intersection with other axes of differentiation, such as race, such as social class. Then we will transition to talking about the history of the women's movement, where we will broadly outline the history of the growth of the women's movement in their particular socio-historical contexts globally, including the women's movement in India. We will broadly cover base with theories of feminism in the in lecture number 6, where we will see how there are broad types of feminist movements and broad types of feminisms that are operative in society globally and in India. Next, we will transition to ideas of gender and how it is expressed in social institutions such as family and marriage. So, in this lecture and in the next lecture, so lecture 8 and 9, we will talk about ideas of patriarchy, ideas of matrilineage, ideas of kinship and family. So, what are the similarities, what are the connections between kinship and family, and we will talk about the role of technology as it is an emerging way of expression, an emerging field of research, the role of technology in influencing intimate relations such as in family and marriage. Next, we will talk about gender and education, where we will talk about gender and its role in enrollment, curriculum, content, educational content, dropout rates, dropout histories, and history and recent trends in women's education. For gender and health, we will cover socioeconomic determinants of health, issues and gender dimensions of infertility, and will focus on reproductive health care, and we will continue talking about that in lecture number 12, technology and healthcare. That is how the role of technology influences contemporary healthcare in India and across the globe. In lecture number 13, we will explore the ideas of normativity, subversions, and queer identities, where we will talk about queer theories, issues of the rights of sexual minorities and transgender in India and globally. Lecture 14, we will talk about representation of gender in culture and media, where we will talk about approaches to read gender in literature and consumption of literature, culture, media, and how gender actually manifests itself, and we find patterns of gender in these spaces. Lecture 15, we will talk about gender ecology and the environment, where we will examine relationships of gender, particularly how gender is expressed with relation to the earth, the non-human nature, and human beings. So, we will explore that interconnection between the non-human and the human through this lecture. Lecture 16, we will talk about gender and globalization, where we will look at the socioeconomic determinants of how gender fares in the global political atmosphere, and the role of gender in development globally and in India. Lectures 17 and 18 will discuss the various research methods, qualitative and quantitative, that we can engage in and frame research focusing on gender in society, and we will discuss research design, strategies and goals using specific methodologies. Lecture 19, we will talk about gender research across the world, where we will discuss the commonalities and differences in gender research across the globe, and the various social structures that help shape research questions around them. So, that will give you an overall picture of the state of research that has been ongoing in terms of gender across the world. And we will wrap up with lecture number 20 with a course conclusion, where it will give us an opportunity to pull all of these together and understand the state of gender in society as we are currently in the global scenario, and what are the future directions of gender in society that we can think of. So, this is in a nutshell, very briefly, the course structure that we are going to follow. So, as I said in the very beginning, that gender and society, as you can see on the slide, that it's gender and society or gender in society, whichever way you want to look at it, can be heavily interdisciplinary in nature. And the three broad disciplines that I will draw from in this course are primarily sociological, and I will draw from research done anthropologically speaking and of course historically speaking. So we will focus primarily on a sociological understanding of gender, but we will borrow from all these other disciplines to engage in a possibly interdisciplinary dialogue when it comes to understanding gender in any given society. So to start with, in this lecture, I do want to pose certain questions to you, and I do want to start thinking about some of the very basic questions that we will need to clarify, we will need to understand before we proceed through the course. And the first question that we need to clarify is to understand what is society. So how is society understood in social sciences? And the next question that we need to understand is what is gender. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of details on what is society and how is society understood in social sciences, because there are full-fledged other courses that actually explain that, but I will just walk you through the basic concepts that we will need for this course to understand what is gender and to identify the key characteristics, issues and problems relevant to gender in society. So for the uninitiated, so for those who are not probably familiar with the field of sociological understanding, the field of sociology, sociology is this scientific study of human behavior in society, and that is pretty much what we are planning to do here, is to understand particular human behavior in any given society in a scientific way, in a scientifically answerable way. So that is in a nutshell how we understand sociology. And just to give you a few basic facts of what we would be aiming for to understand, that sociology is about understanding humans as social beings. So human beings like to be in communities, human beings like to be in groups, they like to be in societies, and so they have evolved as social beings. So human beings are social beings, and that is one of the starting points for us to understand gender in society. The second point is that humans are social observers. So it is hardly ever you will find a person who will not observe anything. So we all are social observers, and how we observe or what we do after we observe, differ. But then we as social beings, we are all social observers, and humans have their social location. So this term needs a little bit of explanation. So I assume you all understand how we understand, the location of a place on a map. So you have a series of latitudes and you have a series of longitudes, and you determine the position of a place on a map based on the intersections of the latitudes and the longitudes. Social location is kind of that, only that it is determined by the points of intersection with the axis of differences, social differences. For example, gender, age, education, religion, nationality, marital status. So all of these are called the axis of differences, and they determine a person's social location at that given point of time and in that given space. So we will build on this concept of social location over and over again through the rest of the course. I just wanted to introduce the concept, the term to you, so it's easier for you to follow in the next lectures. So at this point, I want you to pause a little and answer that what are some of the questions that you have about the society that you live in. So, what I am getting to here is to help you reflect back, and probably you can take a notebook and list down some of the very basic questions that you have about the society, some of the very basic sociological questions that you have about the society that you live in. Okay, so I left you with a question that you need to understand what are some of the very basic sociological questions that you have for the society that you live in, and I assume that you have a few basic questions that you are looking for an answer. So just keep those questions with you as we move through this lecture. So starting to understand sociology and starting to understand a sociological emphasis on gender in society, we need to understand that humans cannot be understood apart from their social context. So social context becomes very important for us to understand gender patterns, gender expressions in society. The next fact that we need to remember is that society makes us who we are by structuring out interactions and organizing us. So in other words, society is a social construct. So a social construct, which is an idea that is created by us, that is created by humans, and society thrives, society grows, society changes through social interactions and through shared understanding. So this is also denoting to the fact that society is not static. Society is organic, it is not static, it is fluid, it changes over time, and we need to keep in mind that this fact about society, that it is fluid, it changes over time. So just to sum it up, then what are the key characteristics of a society? A society is a large social grouping. So as I said, human beings are social animals. So they like to stay in a community. So it's a large social grouping, shares a geographical or a territory or social territory. So they have a shared sense of a territory, whether it's geographical or social. They have the same political authority. They have a dominant cultural expectation, and they have patterned ways that distinguish their group from other groups. So the last 2 points, that there's a dominant cultural expectation and there are patterned ways that distinguish one group from the other, as you will see, will become increasingly important for us to understand that what are these dominant cultural expectations with regard to gender that we are trying to study. What are the patterned ways of gender expression that we are trying to study in any given society. So it is for that reason it is important for us to acknowledge that these are attributes of society, and we need to keep them in mind. So as I said, that societies change over time, and very broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, there are these various stages that societies supposedly pass through, and starting with the pre-industrial societies where it is characterized by small size settlements, rural settlements dependent on local resources, and then they pass through time and they enter the industrial society phase. And these idea of the transition from the pre-industrial to the industrial society comes up with the industrial revolution of 18th century, particularly which started in Europe. And in industrial societies we see there is an increased sense of wealth, productivity, introduction of technology in society, rise of urban centers, growth of business class in society. And then we pass through Another revolution which is fairly new, fairly contemporary, that we identify 1950s onwards, which produces the post-industrial societies, or how we more commonly understand information societies, often characterized by digital technologies. So as you will see, as you have already seen in the set of 20 lectures, that we have tried to address that social change that societies pass through, and try to understand an important social pattern such as gender through time and space, and keeping in mind that societies evolve through time and space. So we will constantly refer to the building blocks in this respect, where we will talk about the social institutions, social processes, and social patterns. So just to walk you through what each of these mean. So social institutions would be the principal social arrangements that guide us in society. So we all know that society is comprised of an institution called family, called marriage, called education, called religion, and it is very hard to find a society that doesn't have any or all of these institutions. So these are ubiquitous, so you find them almost in any given society. These are called social institutions. They help social arrangements in society. Next, we understand social processes or social systems, which defines limits on our behavior, our roles in society, determines our status in society, and we find that gender forms a good example in this case, that gender comes up as a process, as a system that limits our behavior, that tells us what we can do and what we cannot do, that defines our roles in society, that determines our status in. But just like gender, gender is not the only example in this case. Just like gender, we have these other processes such as social class, such as caste in the Indian context, such as religion, such as nationality, which actually operate most of the time together to give a person's social location, as I was talking about previously. So it is important for us to acknowledge that these are these important social processes operative in society, and gender is one of these significant processes. And then we have social patterns which identify human behavior and how it acts with social institutions and structures to produce patterns or trends in society. So we talk about the joint family, we talk about the nuclear family, so we talk about all sorts of patterns in society that we see, that are expressed in society, and that helps us understand society much better. So these are the three building blocks that we will refer to while talking about gender in society. So if we want to look at or understand social reality and understand social problems, there are certain routes that we can take, and there are more ways than one, as I said, and one scientific way to actually look at or to understand social reality and social problems is first to start with a theoretical framework, first to understand that what are my boundaries, or what are my theoretical boundaries or parameters that I want to identify to understand a certain problem. Next, closely related to that is the scientifically acceptable rules of evidence. So it's an evidence-driven science. We need to understand what are these evidence that we have, and there are these scientifically acceptable rules to gather evidence. So we need to keep in mind that, and we need to identify the sociological concerns. So the ideas of description and ideas of analysis. So when we look at a pattern in society, we are either describing that pattern, or we are analyzing that pattern, or we are doing both probably. So to bring in a very, very important concept in this regard, proposed by C.W. Mills in 1959, is the idea of a sociological imagination, which is a contribution from all these three building blocks of institution, structures and patterns that form sociological imagination, which is the ability to see relationship between individual experiences and the larger society. So what we are going to do here is to identify these relationships between individual experiences and the larger society, and that can be, appreciated, that can be acknowledged. One of the ways that can be acknowledged is through Mill's sociological imagination. So now I will walk you through some of the concepts that we will need to understand gender, particularly in society. So all I was doing previously was to walk you through some of the concepts to understand society, and now I'm going towards introducing some of the concepts we will need to understand, clarify, to understand gender in society. And I start with the first concept, which is the concept of categories. So categories, you all are familiar with the term, but it needs to be clarified what exactly do we mean by it. So these are grouping of people. So we are constantly arranging ourselves into groups, and we are either grouping up with similar people, and in a way we are also differentiating ourselves or another group in the process. So categories are groupings of people in this respect, and most common groupings are based on the biological condition or the biological sex of human being, that is male or female. So just to give you an example here, when you hear that a baby is born, when you hear that somebody had a baby, what is the first question do you think that a person will ask when somebody hears that a baby is born? Yes, you got it right. So the first question that probably will be asked is it a boy or a girl, right? So you hardly ever hear the first question to be, how much does the baby weigh, or how much is the baby healthy? We all ask that questions, but the most commonly asked question when somebody hears that a baby is born is it a boy or a girl? So you see that right from birth, human beings are attached to a category just by virtue of the biological condition. That is, if a baby is born as male, the baby is becomes a boy, and a baby becomes born as a female, the baby is expected to be a girl. So this is a conceptual clarification that we need to make constantly, that the biological condition of the body and the idea of gender are not synonymous to each other. They are not identical to each other. They inform one another, but they are not identical concepts. So the other forms of categories that we can talk about here are how we group ourselves in terms of age, in terms of nationality, religion, ethnicity, race, etc. The next concept that we need to acknowledge here to understand gender are the idea of stereotypes. So again, you must be familiar with the idea of stereotyping, and I'm going to give you a couple of definitions here about stereotypes. The first one was proposed by Lupton in 1992, where stereotyping refers to the process by which one-sided or exaggerated and usually prejudiced views of groups or categories of people are developed and maintained. So you see that once you form categories, once you are forms groups, there can be a tendency to produce one-sided stories, one-sided, exaggerated, usually prejudiced, as Lupton calls it, to view certain groups or to view certain people, and these produce stereotypes that are maintained over time and probably generations. So just to give you, an additional point on that, the second definition is by Chimamanda Adichie, who is a Nigerian author. She says that the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So this is what she calls the danger of a single story, that if there is multiple ways of telling a story, and if you take only one version of a story or one characteristic feature of a group and make it sound like the only characteristic feature, then chances are that you're producing a stereotypical way of understanding. So stereotype is one concept here that we will have to look out for, and we will have to analyze if we come across one. The third concept here is the idea of cultural factors, and here we need to acknowledge the idea of knowledge production, beliefs, values and norms, and all of them are directly related to how we understand gender in society, and how we link categories of people to symbolic social structures. So how are cultural factors contributing to linking various categories of people to various symbolic structures that we had seen in previous slides. And finally, here we are trying to understand nature of social relationships. So through an understanding of gender relations, we are trying to understand social relationships. So social relationships forms a very important concept for us to keep in mind. Here we cannot avoid but talk about culture, the role of culture along with the previous concepts. So we talk about cultural factors, but if you take culture as a whole, this is a good definition to show the relationship between culture and society by Susie Jolly, that people are influenced and informed by their cultural environments. At the same time, they influence and build the cultures around them, changing them as they resist and reinforcing and recreating them as they conform. So you see that culture and society have a symbiotic relationship. They inform each other, they change each other, they influence each other, and neither culture nor society are static. So both of them are fluid, both of them are processes, both of them are constantly evolving, and they at the same time simultaneously they are informing and influencing each other. So with that in background, let us now try to answer what is gender. And once we have understood what is gender, next question we need to ask is, to what extent are gender relations affected by changes in social structure, and to what extent are they independent of such changes? So here we are trying to understand first, what do we understand by gender, and then how are these social relationships formed through gender affected by changes in social structure. That is why there was a need for you to understand what social structures are, and to what extent are they independent of such changes. So gender has an origin and a history, has a background. So if you look at the academic literature, if you look at the research on gender, until the 1970s, 1980s, you will see that academic disciplines, in fact, they talked a lot about the sociology of women. So, around the 1970s and 80s, I'm talking about that time, that it was a very in thing, it was a very significant thing to talk about the sociology of women. And with the second wave of feminism in the US around the same time, there were severe criticisms that sociology faced as a discipline for not including, for not concentrating or not considering women as its research subjects. So what we see until then was that most of these research kind of ignored women as research subjects, and at the same time kind of assumed men as a generic category in society. The fact that men as a category are also a gendered category was absent from this conversation. So shortly after that comes an approach that we see in the academic literature that was coined, it's a term that was coined by Dorothy Smith in 1974, of adding women and stirring approach. So add women and stir. So this was an approach that academia kind of adopted, that because there was an absence, acute absence of women as research subjects in sociology. This was a moment when there was a phase of adding women to the conversation, to the research, and stirring. So it's kind of an ingredient that you forgot to add in a recipe, and now you're adding it to that. So this approach was called adding women and stirring approach. So what happened with this add women and stir approach is that not only did research around that time concentrate heavily on women as research subjects, but also highlighted differences between women and men rather than looking at variations among women or variations among men. So it was kind of assumed that as categories, so if you recall the definition of category here, as categories, women and men are two distinct categories, two homogeneous categories, that is, all women are the same and all men are the same. And this approach kind of highlighted the differences between women and men and did not take into consideration the variations that we see amongst women or within women as a category or within men as a category. So this approach was absent. So what happened next, and this is kind of in an ongoing phase of that, with a good deal of research progress that has happened since then, is to rethink the key assumptions that we have about our social world. So one fundamental assumption that there was for this in this respect was that these categories of women and men were homogeneous categories. So that kind of was challenged, and so as a sociological understanding of gender, these categories needed to be rethought, and the assumptions that we had of our social world needed to be revised or needed to be revisited. So we see that this absence of women as research subjects from a sociological understanding or from any disciplinary focus was actually taken up by the United Nations. And in the United Nations report of 1987, they state that women constitute half the world's population, perform nearly 2/3 of its work hours, receive 1/10 of the world's income, and own less than 1/100th of the world's property. So the United Nations took up the task of bringing the question of women into the mainstream academia, into mainstream sociological understanding. And in July 2010, we see the birth of UN Women, and here you can see the link to the UN Women if you want to go there and take a look, that they are heavily invested, if not solely invested, in attaining gender equality across the world. So this actually became an international issue over time, and it continues to be so in this respect. So given this background, what is gender? So how do we understand gender? What is, if I ask you to define gender, what are the possible definitions that we can produce? So one of the starting definitions that was proposed by Kessler and McKenna in 1978 was that gender is the psychological, social and cultural aspects of maleness and femaleness. As you can see, that it is a good starting point to understand what gender is, but it also can be too narrow to understand, because it puts a lot of weight on, again, the biological condition of the body. So while this is a good starting point, it kind of became a narrow focus. So in 1999, Ridgway and Smith-Lovin actually proposed a definition of gender, where they define gender as a system of social practices that creates distinctions and organizes relations of inequality on the basis of these distinctions. So from a psychological, social, individualistic, attribute of maleness and femaleness, the second definition actually brings gender to a platform of social practices. So it brings gender to a larger level of understanding that it is not just an individual attribute, it is a social process, and it is a social structure, and it is a series of, or a system of, social practices. So it just renders a larger scale to understanding gender as a wider social practice. So to sum up here, we have talked about how the sociology of women made way to the sociology of gender, through time, and with the moving a focus from this, just from the sociology of women to a broader focus of understanding gender, we see a growing literature on men and masculinity. So until until the time that sociology was just, the sociology of women actually operated, we see a complete absence of literature on men and masculinity in society. Not just that, we see that men as a category were the assumed category, were the generic category, and therefore we do not see much literature on men and masculinity until recently, where there is a growing sense of need. So men, in this growing literature, are not seen as an assumed category in society, but as gendered, not as a generic category, which also puts forward a very important idea that gender is relational. So gender is the relationship that people have with one another, and not just the static biological condition that one has. This growing literature also talks about the various types of masculinities and femininities, just to assure that there are multiple ways of negotiating masculinity or femininity, and this literature actually does that. So it talks about the relations of domination and subordination, and finally we see a phase of research where gender's relation with the other bases of distinction and stratification are highlighted. So we see that gender's conceptual development, not just as women's stories or just as men's stories, but how people relate to each other in society, and this relationship is often a power relationship. So we see that in some ways that not just a one-on-one relationship, but it often gives rise to a power relationship. And we see that there are focus areas of gender studies that talk about feminisms, multiple versions of feminism, masculinity studies, transgender studies, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual and queer studies, or the LGBTQ studies. So we see that there are these various focus areas of gender studies in recent times, and it's not just about understanding differences between men and women as categories, but it is more nuanced than that. So it is also misleading to talk about gender in vacuum. So gender as a category does not operate in vacuum, but it operates as at intersections with other axes of differences, as I said, and the most important axis of differences in this case are the biological sex of the body, age, ethnicity, nationality, religion, education, marital status. So you see that a person's gender identity, if I have to say, is not just a person's gender identity. It operates at intersections with any or all or beyond these lists. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. So it operates at intersections with these other axes of differentiations, and that is what gives a person's social location, as we started off saying. So just to talk about the dynamics of gender, that families, communities, cultures, they all determine what women and men do in society. So we talk about norms and expectations and behaviors, and women and men are expected to have certain characteristics, aptitudes and behaviors in society, and we are born into environments in which gender roles exist. We learn them and or we change them. So it is important for us to understand that these gender identity or gender role or gender expression, however you want to define it, they are learned. So you know when a baby is born, that baby actually grows up learning certain behavior, and gender behavior is one such behavior, as we will see in the next lecture. But just for now, it is important for you to remember that gender is fluid. It is a process. It is not static. So it is, it is not a given. It is a multi-level phenomenon, as Rizma 98, quoted, that we see gender operative at multiple levels. So we see it at the individual level, we see at the institutional level, we see at the global level. So it is a multi-level phenomena that we see, over time and space. And gender organizes relations, often creates inequality. So gender is an organizing principle in human society, if not the most important organizing relation. So if you recall the example I just gave you about a baby being born, and people asking whether it's a girl or a boy, all we are trying to do is to fit into a category that we need to know for ourselves which category does the baby qualify for. Is it a male or a female? Is it a boy or a girl? So it is organizing a relation. So we are trying to, as human beings, we are trying to organize relations through gender in society. But again, I want to remind you that the biological condition of the body is not equal to how we understand gender. They are informing each other but not synonymous. So there are certain frameworks that help us understand gender that I just talked about. There is the individual level, where we talk about expressions of masculinity, expressions of femininity, etc. We talk about interactional, so we talk about how gender is an interaction between people within a society, and how we have this shared symbolic understanding. And it can be institutional, so it can be a system of processes at the institutional level, which helps us or gives us a framework to understand gender. So now I want you to reflect back, given this understanding, of gender, that why do we need to study gender? So what is, what are the important things that we get to learn once we are, exposed to the idea of how gender operates in society? So as I mentioned, that gender is an organizing principle of the social world. So for us as human beings, if we want to organize ourselves in society, if we want to understand ourselves, categorize ourselves in society, gender is one of the very significant ways in which we organize ourselves within a society. It is pervasive across time and space. So, gender has been operative through time and space, and just to remind you, it is not static. So it has been changing over time and space, and it is fluid. So it is not, to talk about gender maybe 10 or 20 years ago would not be the same as talking about gender today. Gender shapes identities and behavioral dispositions. So, our identities are informed by gender, our behaviors are guided by gender principles. So gender actually gives us, in a way, the understanding of who we are. Gender shapes the ways of social interaction. So the patterns that we talk about, the ways in which we interact in society are shaped by gender. And finally, to sum it all up, it organizes social institutions. So just to remind you of a few examples of social institutions, we talked about family, marriage, education, religion. So all of that, gender plays a very, very significant role to organize, human beings, to organize people in society in these social institutions. So what happens when culture and gender intersect? So we talked about culture and society, and that culture and society are both evolving, are changing, are fluid, and we saw that they constantly inform each other. But let's look at how culture and gender intersect and what happens. So we have seen that culture is dynamic. So cultures survive by responding to changing realities. So, realities change, societies pass through various stages, and, cultures also change. So, it is a very dynamic, it has a dynamic characteristic. Gender roles are also dynamic, so they can and do change. So, we have seen that, gender is fluid, gender is not static, and gender roles are dynamic. So just like culture, gender is also dynamic. Evolving gender roles are integral to the continuing evolution that each culture undergoes to survive. So it is a requirement that our gender roles evolve to continue the evolution, to continue for cultural survival over time and through space. So it is a requirement that both culture and gender, they evolve over time just to give each other the characteristic that they continue to have. And not surprisingly, culture and gender are impacted by a set of practices and policies, starting with globalization, technology, market, economy, environment, political conflict, development projects. So all of these actually influence and impact gender and culture, and and it is therefore very important that as fluid as gender is, it continues to be so. There is one more thing I want to introduce to you in this lecture, is the idea of knowledge. So we talk about knowledge production. So by understanding that gender is not the biological condition of the body. It's not synonymous to the biological condition of the body. You're kind of producing a new sense of knowledge. You're kind of being exposed to the new kind of knowledge. So, knowledge can be fluid also. So, what is considered knowledge changes over time and across cultures, and the access to knowledge or having a set of knowledge can be a power relationship between people. So, just to keep in mind at this point that the idea of knowledge production, the idea of knowledge changes across time. As I just said earlier, that what it meant to be gender, what it meant to understand gender 10 or 20 years ago is not the same to probably understand it now. So, the concepts of time and space are very important in this regard. So, when we understand time, we are not just talking about the historical chronological time through as we understand it to be. We are also understanding time in terms of its socio-historical contexts, and we are also understanding time with regard to traditional what we call to be the politics of time, which is how we talk about traditional, modern, postmodern. So, all these terms that we use are form the politics of time. So, when we call something modern, oftentimes something is modern because something else is traditional. So, I am not proposing a binary here, but then it's a relational thing that traditional, modern, postmodern, we say these we use these terms to denote something beyond just description. And then for space, just like time, we are not just talking about geographical space, we are also talking about social space. We talk about gendered space, ethnic space, religious space, and we also talk about the politics of social location. So, just to keep in time how keep in mind that how time and space operates. So, with this idea of knowledge and morality, it is important for us to understand where we posit ourselves in terms of morality and analysis. So, what we are doing here is analysis. So, morality is one thing that you have a value laden judgment about good, bad, right or wrong. We are not really doing that here. What we are doing is to analyze or questioning why something exists. So, it's kind of analytical approach, and then understand how gender and our knowledge of it is socially constructed. So, we need to understand the contradictions in our thinking. We need to identify the categories that we are familiar with, the stereotypes that we are familiar with, the contradictions that we have in our mind, and we need to understand and analyze critically that why that exists. So, we talk about equality all the time with respect to gender. So, we believe in equality, but I want to ask you, who is that we, and then who is the who do we want equality for? So, this is a reflective question when we talk of equality, particularly with terms of in terms of gender, that we believe in equality, but who is that equality that we are aiming for? So, is it equality for all? Is it equality for some? So, these are the critical questions that you have to constantly battle with and analyze in this course. So, I want to conclude with this question for you today, is that given that what we have talked about today, why does gender matter to you? Is a reflective question that you need to sit back and reflect, that what is it about gender, what is it with regard to gender that matters to you. So, what is it about gender in society, or gender at the individual level for you, or gender at the institutional level, or gender in society matters to you? So, you need to list out these questions and keep them with you for the rest of the course. So, as we move through the lectures, you're able to go back to these questions and see, if you are able to understand it better. Okay. So, if you want to go and take a look at further reading, please take a look at Amy Wharton's Sociology of Gender, the first chapter. That will give you a fair sense of the idea of gender in society. And in the next lecture, we will continue this topic of understanding biology and gender, and what are the points of similarity and what are the points of departure between the biological condition of the body and gender. Okay, thank you very much.